On the 23rd of August, the air outside Theodore's cabin was a shimmering sheet of heat, measured at 97 degrees Fahrenheit by the precise German thermometer he kept sheltered in the deep shade of the eaves. Inside William's cabin, a half-mile down the creek, the temperature was a suffocating 88 degrees. William, a man whose sweat seemed to have its own sweat, was huddled not by a fire but by the open door of his root cellar, hoping a phantom breath of cool air might find its way out. He was carrying potatoes, one by one, their skins soft and their eyes already sprouting long, pale fingers of decay. In Theodore's cabin, it was 68 degrees. He sat at his table in his shirt sleeves, mending a leather strap, perfectly at ease. The air was still and pleasant. He was not barefoot, as that was an indulgence he did not permit himself, but he felt the comfort of a man who commanded his environment rather than suffered it. He needed an apple. He stood, walked to a thick, insulated door in his floor, and descended a set of steep stairs into absolute coolness. Down in his subterranean larder, the same German thermometer registered a constant, unwavering 44 degrees. He picked an apple from a barrel, its skin so cold it was almost wet to the touch, and the crisp snap it made when he bit into it was the sound of a problem solved. It was the sound of a victory over the seasons, a victory that his neighbor, William, could not possibly comprehend. William watched his own winter stores turning to mush in the oppressive, unrelenting heat. The question of how this was possible hung in the shimmering air between their two homesteads, as silent and profound as the deep earth itself. We appreciate you joining us for this account of quiet ingenuity. Before we uncover the tragedy that sparked this remarkable innovation, we invite you to let us know where you are watching from in the comments below. Your viewership from around the world is a constant inspiration. And if you find value in these stories of forgotten history, please consider subscribing to our channel. The story we have planned for next week is, in its own way, even more unbelievable. A tale of physics and desperation that seems to defy the very laws of possibility. The victory had been born from the bitterest of defeats, a failure that had cost more than a season's worth of apples. It had happened 2 years prior, in the Minnesota Territory, in the bleak final days of a February that had already lasted a lifetime. The land was a study in brutal absolutes. The summers were a suffocating blanket of heat and insects, capable of wilting a man as surely as it wilted his crops. The winters were a physical assault, a relentless siege of wind and cold that sought out every chink in a man's armor, every crack in his cabin's walls, every weakness in his planning. Survival was not an assumption. It was a year-long, tactical campaign against nature. And the most critical battle was fought not in the depths of winter, but in the preservation of the summer's bounty. The standard weapon in this battle was the root cellar, a simple hole dug into the earth, lined with stone if a man was fortunate, and covered with a heavy timber roof. It was a technology as old as settlement itself, a flawed but trusted defense against the seasons, yet its flaws were profound. It was a compromise, a structure that would never be truly warm and would never be truly cold enough. In winter, the frost line crept down, threatening to turn potatoes to icy stones. In the summer, the pervasive heat of the sun soaked slowly into the ground, raising the temperature of the shallow chamber until it became less a sanctuary and more a slow-baking oven, hastening the very decay it was meant to prevent. The heat fled through every gap in the winter, and the rot crept through every moment of warmth in the summer. It was a tool of compromise, and the frontier was a place that had little patience for compromise. The frontier had no patience for compromise, and it offered no mercy for failure. Theodore learned this lesson not from his own cellar, but from that of his friend Samuel. Samuel was a good man, careful and competent, not given to carelessness. He was the last person one would expect to fall victim to a failure of preparation. Yet, when Theodore arrived at his cabin for a planned visit in that last week of February, he was met not by Samuel's familiar greeting, but by a profound and unsettling silence. The silence of a homestead gone wrong. The chimney was cold, a thin plume of old snow capping it like a tombstone. No smoke, no movement, just the vast, indifferent quiet of the frozen woods. He knocked, his knuckles loud in the stillness. He called out Samuel's name. The only answer was the creak of a frozen branch in the wind. He pushed the door open. It was not barred. Inside, the cabin was dark and colder than the air outside, a deep, penetrating cold that spoke of a fire long dead. The smell hit him first, acrid and sour, the smell of sickness. And then his eyes adjusted to the gloom. He saw Samuel in his bed, a still form beneath a pile of quilts. He saw his wife, Sarah, in a chair by the hearth, slumped as if she had simply fallen asleep and never woken. And in a small cot in the corner, their 2 young children, still and silent. It was a scene of absolute, peaceful devastation. It was not violence or an accident that had claimed them. It was something quiet, something insidious that had crept in from within. On the table sat a half-eaten bowl of preserved beans, their color off, a faint, milky sheen to the liquid they sat in. Theodore knew, with a sickening certainty, what had happened. He had heard stories of it, the hidden poison of poorly kept food, the botulism that grew in the cloying warmth of a failed cellar and showed no sign until it was too late. It was a failure of preservation, a failure of the cellar, a failure that began not in the killing cold of February, but in the sweltering, forgotten heat of the previous August. The heat of the previous August had planted the seeds of this winter tragedy. Driven by a grim, methodical need to understand, Theodore left the cabin's silent occupants and walked to the cellar door outside. He pulled the heavy, diagonal plank door open, the frozen hinges groaning in protest. A wave of air met him, and it was this air that confirmed his theory. It was not the crisp, clean cold of a proper cellar. It was damp, stagnant, and held a faint, sweetish undertone of rot. It was the smell of failure. He descended the rough-hewn earthen steps, his boots thudding softly in the confined space. Down in the darkness, he lit a small tallow lamp. The cellar was a small, stone-lined chamber, no more than 6 feet deep. It was exactly the kind of cellar every man in the territory built. It was the kind of cellar he had. The shelves were still half full. He saw barrels of apples, their skins wrinkled and bruised. He saw bins of potatoes, many of which were soft, sprouting feebly in the gloom. And he saw the row of glass jars containing Sarah's preserved vegetables. He picked one up, a jar of the same beans that sat on the table inside. He held it to the light. It looked perfect. There was no sign of spoilage, no cloudiness, no warning. But he knew the poison was there, invisible and patient. He spent nearly an hour in that tomb of a cellar, not just looking, but observing. He ran his hand along the stone walls. They felt cool, but not cold. They were clammy, beaded with a fine layer of condensation. He pressed his palm against the hard, packed dirt floor. He could feel the proximity of the frost line, but it was a shallow cold, a surface chill that had not penetrated the deep earth. He understood then that the structure itself was the flaw. It was a trap. It fought the winter cold ineffectively and surrendered to the summer heat completely. It had allowed the ambient warmth of August and September to linger, creating the perfect breeding ground for the invisible spores of death. Samuel had not been careless. He had been betrayed by conventional wisdom, by a design that everyone used and no one questioned. He had been a victim of flawed technology, not a flawed character. And as Theodore stood there in the chilling, damp air of his friend's failed cellar, a cold and resolute purpose began to form within him. He would not just mourn Samuel. He would solve the problem that killed him. He would wage a war not against the cold, but against the heat. He would wage a war against the heat, and his weapons would be observation and measurement. The grief for Samuel and his family settled into a hard, dense core inside him. But it was not a grief that crippled. It was a grief that fueled. It transformed him from a frontiersman into an obsessed innovator, a quiet, natural philosopher of the soil. He became a man possessed by a single, overriding question. How does heat move through the earth? He began his work not with a shovel, but with a notebook and a pencil. The notebook was his ledger of the earth's secrets, and he filled its pages with meticulous, spidery script. He purchased 3 new thermometers, the best he could find, sending away to a supplier in St. Louis. He built small wooden cases for them to prevent breakage and attached them to long twine. His first experiment was simple. He dug a series of holes on his property. One was 2 feet deep, another 4 feet, a third 6 feet, the standard depth of a cellar, and a fourth, the deepest he could manage with a standard spade, was 8 feet. Every morning at the same hour and every evening at the same hour, he would lower a thermometer into each hole, let it rest for a full 10 minutes, and then haul it up to record the temperature. He did this every single day. Through the spring thaw, the summer blaze, the autumn chill, and into the next winter's freeze. His neighbors saw him as a man addled by sorrow, tending his strange, empty holes with a bizarre devotion. They did not see the data accumulating in his notebook, the columns of numbers that were beginning to paint a clear and startling picture. The numbers painted a clear and startling picture of 2 distinct worlds. The top 6 feet of soil were a battleground, a zone of wild fluctuation. In the summer, he recorded temperatures as high as 75 degrees at the 2-foot mark, and nearly 70 degrees at the 6-foot mark. This was the fatal flaw. A cellar dug to this depth was not in the earth. It was merely in the warm crust of the earth, a crust that baked for 3 months straight. In the winter, the numbers plummeted, dropping below freezing and threatening everything within. But the reading from the 8-foot hole was different. It was more stable. It warmed more slowly in the summer and cooled more slowly in the winter. It was better, but it was not the solution. The solution, he suspected, was deeper. His obsession grew beyond his own property. He became a collector of data from the entire settlement. With a quiet, almost apologetic persistence, he would visit his neighbors, notebook in hand. He would ask permission to measure the temperature in their cellars. He measured William's cellar, finding it peaked at a disastrous 72 degrees in late August. He measured the cellar of the Jensen family, which was dug into a shady, north-facing hill, and found it was a few degrees cooler, a small but significant clue. He noted the type of soil, the amount of shade, the proximity to the creek. Every detail was recorded. Every measurement was another piece of the puzzle. He filled one notebook and then another. The pages were a tapestry of numbers, charts, and small hand-drawn maps of the settlement, dotted with temperature readings. He was no longer just a trapper and a farmer. He was a cartographer of temperature, mapping the unseen flows of heat and cold that governed their very survival. He was mapping the unseen flows of heat, and slowly, a fundamental principle began to reveal itself to him from the pages of his own data. The Earth was a vast reservoir of temperature, but it was a layered one. The surface was chaotic, a slave to the sun and the air. But deeper down, there was a place of profound stability. His data from the 8-foot hole hinted at it, but he needed to go deeper. He could not dig such a hole himself, not easily. The well at the center of the settlement, however, was 30 feet deep. One sweltering afternoon in July, he unhooked the bucket and lowered his thermometer down. He let it hang for half an hour, suspended 25 feet below the surface, far below the influence of the baking sun. When he pulled it up, his hand trembling slightly with anticipation, the reading was 48 degrees. He checked it again. 48 degrees. On a day when the air temperature was 95 degrees and the soil 6 feet down was 70, the deep earth was a constant, unshakable 48. It was the breakthrough. It was the epiphany. The goal was not merely to dig a hole in the ground. The goal was to reach this deep, stable sanctuary of cold, this thermal constant of the earth. Any cellar that failed to reach that depth was just a trap, a poorly insulated box doomed to absorb the summer heat. But reaching the deep earth was only half the solution. He understood that heat did not just radiate from the sun. It also conducted. It moved through the soil itself. Digging a deep hole was useless if the warm earth at the sides of the hole simply bled its heat into the chamber. He had to isolate the cold. He had to build a fortress of cold, with walls that could defend it from the surrounding warmth. He had to build a fortress of cold. And the design for that fortress came not from a book, but from a resurfaced memory. Years before, while trapping in the hill country to the north, he had been caught in a sudden, violent summer thunderstorm. He had taken shelter in the mouth of a small, narrow cave he had stumbled upon. As the hot, humid air of the storm raged outside, he had been struck by the air flowing gently out of the cave's mouth. It was cold. Not cool, but genuinely cold, as if from an ice house. He had not thought much of it then, but the memory now returned to him with the force of revelation. The cave was a natural version of what he needed to build. It was a deep chamber connected by a passage. The cold air, being denser and heavier than warm air, had settled in the cave's depths and stayed there, unable to escape unless displaced. The principle was convection. Warm air rises, cold air sinks. Any cellar with a wide open staircase leading directly down was a perfect chimney for this effect in reverse. Every time the door was opened on a hot day, the precious cold air would spill out, displaced by the lighter, warmer air from above. It was a constant leak. His design, therefore, needed to do two things. First, it had to reach the deep earth, the zone of thermal stability. Second, it had to trap the cold air within it, preventing it from escaping and preventing warm air from entering. The solution was clear in his mind now, a complete and elegant system. It would be a deep, subterranean chamber, fully insulated from the surrounding surface soil and accessed through an airlock, a double-doored trap. He had his theory. He had his data. Now, he needed to turn his revolutionary plan into a physical reality. He needed to turn his plan into a physical reality. And that required materials and tools far beyond the scope of a simple farmer. His first priority was not lumber or stone, but knowledge. He sent a letter with a traveling merchant heading east, along with a significant portion of his fur savings. The letter was addressed to a bookseller in Philadelphia. The letter contained a list, not of novels or almanacs, but of textbooks. He requested any available volumes on thermodynamics, geology, and civil engineering. He knew these were academic subjects, far removed from the practical world of the frontier. But he also knew that the principles were universal. The same laws of physics that governed a steam engine also governed the slow, silent movement of heat through a patch of Minnesota soil. While he waited, he turned to tools. Digging a hole 15 feet deep through hard pan clay and glacial till was not a job for a spade. It was an engineering project. He traveled to the nearest trading post, a 2-day journey. He walked past the barrels of nails, the stacks of axes, and the bolts of cloth. He went directly to the blacksmith. He commissioned a set of heavy-duty iron buckets, reinforced with steel bands. He bought every foot of thick hemp rope the post had in stock. And his most significant purchase, the one that raised the most eyebrows, was a heavy-duty capstan winch, a complex piece of machinery with gears and a brake, designed for moving massive logs or pulling stumps. It was expensive, costing him the value of his entire winter's trapping, but he knew it was the only way he could lift tons of earth from the depths he intended to reach. William watched the transaction with a look of profound bewilderment. "Theodore," he said, his voice a mixture of concern and pity. "What in God's name are you doing with a logging winch? You're not clearing a forest." Theodore simply secured the winch to his wagon. "I'm digging a cellar, William," he replied, his voice calm and even. William just shook his head and walked away, muttering to another settler about poor Theodore, how Samuel's passing had clearly unhinged him. The man was digging a well, not a cellar. He was spending a fortune to do it, and the physical labor was even more costly. Before the first shovel of dirt could be turned, he faced a Herculean task of preparation. He had chosen the site for his larder with the same meticulous care he had applied to his temperature readings. It was on a gentle north-facing slope, nestled in the deep, perpetual shade of 3 ancient oak trees. This location was ideal for minimizing direct solar heating of the ground. However, it was also remote and inaccessible. The ground was a dense, unforgiving mixture of clay and rock, and it was a full 100 yards from the nearest track wide enough for his wagon. He could not bring the winch to the site. He could not haul away the excavated earth. First, he had to build a road. For the entire month of April, Theodore became a road builder. He used his oxen to drag away the largest of the glacial boulders. He spent his days with a pickaxe and a shovel, leveling a path, digging out roots, and filling in low spots. It was grueling, repetitive work. The pickaxe would ring against hidden stones, sending jarring shocks up his arms. The heavy, wet clay clung to his shovel, making every load a struggle against suction and gravity. He worked from the first light of dawn until his muscles screamed in the twilight. He grew leaner, his hands turning into calloused leather. The path slowly, painstakingly, took shape. He was not just clearing a path for a wagon. He was preparing the ground for his grand experiment. He was laying the foundation for his argument against a century of flawed tradition. Each swing of the pickaxe was a refutation of the shallow cellars and spoiled food. Each shovelful of earth was a tribute to Samuel, a physical manifestation of his promise. By the time the road was finished, he had moved several tons. The real digging had not even begun. And when it did, it became a spectacle of slow, methodical progress. He assembled the capstan winch over the spot he had marked, its heavy wooden frame a strange piece of industrial geometry in the quiet woods. The process he developed was a solitary, silent rhythm. He would descend into the growing pit on a rope ladder, his movements precise and unhurried. For an hour he would work in the cool darkness. He worked, breaking up the dense earth with a short-handled pick and shoveling it into one of the iron buckets. The sound of his work was muffled, a dull thudding. When a bucket was full, he would climb out, brace himself against the winch, and begin the slow, circular walk. The gears would groan, the rope would creak, and the heavy bucket of earth would rise slowly into the daylight. He would empty it onto a growing pile, then lower the bucket back and descend once more. This was his life for weeks on end. Down into the earth, fill the bucket, climb out, turn the winch, repeat. The pit grew deeper, its walls becoming a layered map of the soil's geology. A few feet of dark topsoil, then a thick band of dense red clay, and finally a layer of gray, rocky, glacial till that fought him for every inch. He had to shore up the walls as he went, fitting heavy timbers to prevent a collapse. It was dangerous, claustrophobic work. He was keenly aware that a single mistake, a single patch of unstable soil, could turn his great project into his tomb. Yet he worked with a calm, focused intensity, his mind occupied with the physics of his task, not its perils. He was not just digging a hole, he was carving a precise chamber out of the planet, a void that would soon be filled with the one thing that could fight the summer's heat, a permanent, unyielding cold. A permanent, unyielding cold was the goal, and every detail of the construction was designed to protect it. Once he reached his target depth of 15 feet, he began the arduous task of hollowing out the main chamber at the bottom. This was the most dangerous phase. He carved out a space roughly 8 feet square and 8 feet high, leaving a thick pillar of earth in the center for support until he could install the final timber framing. He worked by lantern light, his world reduced to a small circle of rock and clay. The air was cool and smelled of damp stone and deep earth, the very air he was trying to capture. After the chamber was hollowed and heavily braced with thick oak beams, he turned his attention to his first great innovation, the insulation layer. This was the part of his plan that his neighbors found not just foolish, but utterly insane. From the pile, he began to separate the rocks. He spent days hauling them back down into the chamber, where he meticulously lined the floor and walls, fitting the stones together like a massive, three-dimensional puzzle. This stone lining would provide thermal mass, a battery for the cold. But the true genius was in what came next. He had spent the previous autumn preparing his insulating material. He had made charcoal, slow-burning piles of wood until they were reduced to pure carbon. He had also collected sawdust from the small sawmill at the settlement, hauling bag after bag of it back to his homestead. Now he began to mix them, the black, brittle charcoal and the light, fluffy sawdust. He carted this strange, black mixture to the pit and began to backfill, not with dirt, but with his custom-made insulation. He packed it into the space between the timber shoring and the walls, creating a 2-foot-thick barrier of trapped air and poor conductors. He was building a box within a box, a cold stone heart protected from the warmth of the surrounding earth by a thick black layer of his own invention. A thick black layer of his own invention separated his cold chamber from the world, but it did nothing to separate him from the skepticism of his community. The construction of Theodore's Folly, as it was now openly called, became a source of local amusement and concern. Men would stop by on their way to hunt or check their traps, ostensibly to be neighborly, but really to gawk at the strange proceedings. They saw the massive pile of excavated earth, the complex winch, and the buckets filled with his bizarre mixture of charcoal and sawdust. It made no sense to them. William was the most vocal of the skeptics. As a respected elder in the community, his opinion carried weight. He saw Theodore's project not as innovation, but as a dangerous obsession, a waste of time and resources during the critical building months. He confronted Theodore one afternoon, finding him covered in black dust, meticulously tamping the insulation into place. "Theodore," William began, his voice firm but not unkind. "This has gone on long enough. You've spent a whole season digging a hole that's deep enough to be a grave. It's madness. And now you're filling it with burnt wood and shavings? The heat of summer is coming, and you haven't even started on a proper cellar. Just fill this thing in, dig 6 feet down like a sensible man, and be done with it." Theodore paused his work, looking up at William from the edge of the pit. He did not look angry or defensive. He simply looked tired and determined. "A sensible man's cellar is what killed Samuel, William," he said, his voice quiet. 6 feet is not enough. It's a compromise, and I'm done with compromises." William sighed, a deep, frustrated sound. He saw no logic, only grief-fueled delusion. He shook his head and turned to leave. "Don't come to me in August when your potatoes are rotten," he called back over his shoulder. "I'm warning you as a friend." The words were meant to be a warning, but to Theodore they were just noise, the fading echo of a world content with flawed answers. A world content with flawed answers could not see the logic. But one person did. His name was Leo, a young man of 20 who had arrived in the settlement the previous year with his new wife. He was a quiet, observant carpenter, and unlike the established settlers, he was not bound by years of tradition. He had no preconceived notions of how a cellar ought to be built. He was drawn to Theodore's project not by its strangeness, but by its evident purposefulness. He watched from a distance at first, seeing not a madman, but a craftsman engaged in a work of immense precision. He saw the careful measurements, the perfectly fitted timbers, the consistent rhythm of the work. One day he approached Theodore, not with skepticism, but with a simple, direct question. "Why the charcoal?" he asked, pointing to the pile. Theodore, surprised to be addressed with genuine curiosity, paused. He looked at the young man, saw the intelligence in his eyes, and decided to explain. He pulled out one of his notebooks, its pages filled with charts and figures, and showed Leo the temperature readings. He explained the concept of the Earth's thermal constant, of insulation, of conduction. He spoke of how trapped air in the sawdust and charcoal would slow the transfer of heat from the surrounding soil. Leo listened, his brow furrowed in concentration. He was not a physicist, but he understood the principles of building. He understood the concept of an air gap in a wall to keep a house warmer. Theodore's explanation, radical as it was, made a kind of intuitive sense to him. "It's like a giant jug," Leo said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "A stone jug buried in a sawdust box." Theodore nodded. "That's a good way to think of it." From that day on, Leo became Theodore's ally, his first and only believer. He would come by after his own work was done, offering his strong back to help turn the winch, or his carpentry skills to better fit the heavy timbers. He asked for no pay. His reward was the knowledge, the satisfaction of being part of something new and important. His presence was a quiet validation, a silent counter-argument to the mockery of the others. And for Theodore, who had worked in absolute solitude for so long, it was a profound relief. And with Leo's help, the final, most ingenious part of the structure took shape. The cold trap. This was the element that would elevate his design from a simple insulated box to a dynamic, self-regulating system. Instead of building a straight staircase down into the chamber, Theodore designed an angled entryway with a small, level landing in the middle. It was an L-shaped descent. At the top of the stairs, at ground level, he and Leo built a heavy, thick door, packed with sawdust insulation and carefully sealed. Then, at the bottom of the first flight of stairs, on the landing, they built a second, identical door. This created a small, enclosed space, an airlock. The principle, as he explained to a fascinated Leo, was based entirely on the density of air. "Cold air is heavy," Theodore said, sketching the design on a piece of scrap lumber. "Cold air wants to stay at the lowest point. If we have one long, open staircase, every time we open the door at the top, the cold air will flow out like water from a bucket, and the hot air from outside will rush in to replace it." He pointed to his drawing. "But with this design, we open the top door and step onto the landing. The warm air from outside fills this small space. Then we close the top door behind us, trapping that warm air. Only then do we open the bottom door. A little bit of air will mix, but the vast reservoir of cold in the main chamber remains almost entirely undisturbed. The heavy, cold air is trapped. It was a brilliantly simple solution to a complex problem. They spent a week constructing it, their work a model of precision. They fitted the door jambs perfectly, sealed every crack with pitch, and installed heavy iron latches that would pull the doors tight against their frames. When it was finished, the entryway was less like a cellar entrance and more like the hatch of a ship, designed to protect the precious environment within from the world outside. With the final door hung, the construction was complete. Theodore's folly, his subterranean fortress of cold, was ready. It sat silently under the oaks, its low, turf-covered roof barely visible, giving no outward clue to the 15 feet of radical engineering that lay hidden. Hidden in the earth beneath, it waited for its trial. The ultimate test came sooner than anyone expected. That year, the summer arrived not with a gentle warming, but with a sudden, brutal assault. By the first week of July, a heat wave of historic proportions had settled over the territory. The sun was a merciless white disk in a hazy sky. The creeks grew shallow and warm, and the air was thick and still, buzzing with insects. For 10 consecutive days, the temperature soared past 100 degrees. It was a time of immense trial for the settlement. The heat was not just an inconvenience, it was a direct threat to their future. It was an attack on their food. Across the settlement, the conventional root cellars were failing catastrophically. The relentless, penetrating heat soaked deep into the ground, turning the shallow chambers into slow cookers. Reports spread of potatoes turning to black sludge, of carrots and turnips going soft, of the faint, sickeningly sweet smell of rot greeting people when they opened their cellar doors. William's cellar was among the worst. He had a large harvest planned, and his cellar was already well stocked with the early crops. Now he watched in despair as the warmth crept in. The air inside was humid and thick, smelling of damp earth and decay. His wife Mary was beside herself, seeing months of hard labor spoiling before their eyes. This was the ordeal. This was the test Theodore had been preparing for. While his neighbors fretted and despaired, he remained calm, his movements deliberate. Twice a day he would perform his ritual. He would enter the airlock of his deep larder, carefully closing one door before opening the next. He would descend into the profound, silent cold of the main chamber. He would check his thermometer, record the reading in his notebook, and inspect his own stores of apples, potatoes, and salted butter. The structure performed flawlessly. As the world above baked at 102 degrees, the temperature in his subterranean chamber never wavered. It remained a constant, perfect 44 degrees. The insulation was holding back the tide of heat. The cold trap was keeping the dense, chilled air perfectly in place. His apples were as crisp as the day they were picked. His butter was firm. There was no smell but that of clean, cold stone and earth. It was working. The numbers in his notebook, once a theory, were now a proven physical reality. A proven physical reality is a difficult thing to argue with, even for a man as stubborn as William. On the 11th day of the heat wave, his pragmatism finally overcame his pride. He had lost nearly a third of his potato crop. And a whole barrel of apples. He was a man defeated, not by a blizzard or a fire, but by a slow, creeping warmth he could not fight. He walked the half-mile to Theodore's homestead in the oppressive afternoon heat, his steps slow, his shoulders slumped. He found Theodore sitting in the shade of his cabin, calmly carving a new handle for a tool. There was no hint of smugness in Theodore's demeanor. There was no triumphant, "I told you so," in his eyes. He simply looked up and nodded a greeting. "Theodore," William began, his voice rough with humility. I was wrong. He did not need to elaborate. The purpose of his visit was etched on his face. Mary is worried we'll lose everything before the first frost. My cellar, it's 75 degrees. It's a hothouse. Theodore set down his carving and stood. He did not offer platitudes or condolences. He offered evidence. "Come see," he said simply. He led William not to the cabin, but to the low, unassuming mound of earth under the oak trees. He lifted the heavy top door, and a breath of air, noticeably cooler than the ambient 98 degrees, wafted out. "Close it behind you," Theodore instructed, as they stepped onto the small landing. William pulled the thick door shut, sealing them in a small, dim space. Then, Theodore opened the second door. It was like opening the door to a different season. A wave of genuine, penetrating cold washed over them, carrying the clean scent of damp stone. William gasped. It was not the clammy coolness of a normal cellar. It was the deep, invigorating cold of a spring house in April. They descended into the main chamber, and William stopped, staring in disbelief. The air was still and profoundly cold. He saw Theodore's barrels and bins, their contents looking fresh. He looked fresh and vibrant. He reached out and touched the stone wall. It was cold to the touch, shockingly so, as if it were packed in ice. "How?" William whispered, his voice full of awe. "The ground everywhere is warm. How is this possible?" And so, standing in the cold, silent heart of his creation, Theodore explained. He spoke of the deep earth's constant temperature. He described the insulating barrier of charcoal and sawdust that prevented the surface heat. He described how it prevented surface heat from penetrating. He demonstrated the principle of the airlock, showing how it trapped the heavy, cold air. He was not a preacher delivering a sermon. He was a teacher explaining a law of nature. William, the pragmatic skeptic, the champion of conventional wisdom, listened to every word. He was a man who believed in what he could see and touch, and he was standing in a room that should not exist. It was a pocket of winter in the heart of a brutal summer. He was converted, not by rhetoric, but by the undeniable physical proof of a problem solved. "You did it, Theodore," William said, his voice quiet with the weight of his admission. "You solved it. You solved the heat. You solved the heat." The words, coming from his most ardent critic, were Theodore's true vindication. But William's conversion was not a private affair. A man of his standing did not change his mind quietly. He became the larder's most vocal advocate. He spoke of it at the trading post, at community gatherings, his initial mockery replaced with a proselytizer's zeal. He described the shocking cold, the crisp apples, the brilliant design. He admitted his own foolishness in doubting Theodore, an act of public humility that stunned the other settlers into listening. His testimony was a powerful catalyst for change. His testimony, combined with the shared misery of their own failing cellars, was a powerful catalyst for change. The adoption of the innovation began that very autumn. First, Leo, Theodore's loyal ally, began excavating his own deep larder, with Theodore providing guidance and his precious notebooks as a guide. Then, two other families, whose losses during the heat wave had been particularly severe, approached Theodore, hats in hand, and asked for his help. Theodore shared his knowledge freely and without any sense of ownership. He sought no payment, no special status. His reward was in the work itself, in the solving of the problem. He spent that autumn and the next spring supervising their construction, teaching them the principles of insulation and the critical importance of the cold air trap. He showed them how to mix the charcoal and sawdust, how to build the double-doored entryway. He showed them how to measure the depth needed to reach the thermal constant. Theodore's folly was officially dead. In its place, the settler's larder, or the deep larder, became the new standard. The structures began to appear on homesteads throughout the region, their low, grass-covered roofs the only sign of the sophisticated climate control system buried beneath. The community was now united in its adoption of his methods. Their survival no longer a gamble against the summer heat. Their survival was more secure, and Theodore settled into the quiet rhythm of his later life. He never married and never had children of his own, but he became a sort of quiet authority in the community, a respected, if still somewhat eccentric elder. He never sought fame or fortune for his work. When a traveling journalist passed through, he sought an interview. Theodore politely declined, saying only that he had just applied a bit of thought to a common problem. He was not motivated by recognition. His satisfaction was private, derived from the quiet evidence of his success. It was in the sight of his neighbors' children, healthy and well-fed through the harshest winters. It was in the absence of the quiet desperation that had once settled over the community in late February as stores dwindled and spoiled. It was in knowing that no other family would suffer the fate of Samuel's. He lived a long and peaceful life in his small cabin, sustained by the perfect produce from his subterranean larder. He continued his observations, filling notebooks with data on weather patterns, crop yields, and the subtle mechanics of the natural world. He remained, until the end, a student of the quiet forces that shaped their lives. His death, when it came, was as quiet as his life. He passed away in his sleep one spring night at the age of 78. A respected figure whose true genius was only partially understood by the people he had saved. They knew he had designed a better cellar, but few grasped the depth of the scientific inquiry that had led to it. He was buried in the small settlement cemetery, his grave marked by a simple wooden cross, not far from the graves of Samuel, Sarah, and their children. Not far from their graves, his true monument continued its silent, unseen work. The enduring legacy of Theodore was not carved in stone, but dug in the earth. The deep larders he designed and helped build outlasted their creators by generations. Long after the original homesteads were abandoned and the cabins had rotted back into the soil, the low, turf-covered mounds of the larders remained. New settlers would sometimes discover them. They would marvel at the strange, deep cellars with their odd, double-doored entrances. They would find them still remarkably cold, still functional, their ingenious design a quiet testament to a forgotten innovator. Decades later, scientists and engineers would give formal names to the principles Theodore had discovered through pure observation and methodical deduction. They would write papers on geothermal heat exchange. They would write on the R value of various insulating materials, and on the physics of thermal stratification and convection traps. His solitary, grief-driven research had preempted their formal science by half a century. His legacy was measured not in patents or accolades, but in the quiet, cumulative effect of his invention. The generations of families who survived the harsh winters, their health secured by food that did not spoil. He had stared into the face of a tragedy, a failure of conventional wisdom, and had not simply mourned. He had observed, he had measured, he had thought, and he had built. He had left the world a little safer, a little cooler, a little more understood. A quiet, anonymous victory won against the relentless heat of the summer sun.